So my display audio is not coming through. Let me see if I can. Let me see if I can change screens here, and maybe I'll just unplug from the display. Hold on a second. Let's try this. Okay, there we go.
All right, cool, awesome.
All right, let me just adjust. So I'll just roll on my laptop for right now.
Okay, cool. All right, so I'm gonna start. I'll start doing the intro. Okay. All right. So hello everyone. You're listening to the Modern Web Podcast. You can find more podcasts, videos, and events on the modern-web.org, or follow us on Twitter at modern.web. That's modern.web. This podcast is sponsored by this.labs, a framework-agnostic consultancy that specializes in JavaScript. You can find them at this.co/labs. That's this.co/labs. Today we're talking about state management and single-page applications. And our guests are Charles Lowell, co-founder of the Frontside. You can find him on Twitter and GitHub as Cowboy D. Hi, Charles.
Hey, Taras.
We have Tim Dorr, is the primary maintainer for Redux and core contributor to React Router, director of applied research at SalesLoft. You can find him at Tim Dorr on Twitter. Hi, Tim.
Hi.
And we have Michel Weststrate, creator of Mobx and most recently Immer, and lead developer at Mendix. You can follow Michel at Twitter on Twitter at mweststrate. Hi, Michel.
Hey there.
And I'm your host, Taras Mankovski. I'm co-founder and CTO of this.labs, and I mentor developers in React, Vue, and Ember. You can follow me on Twitter at TarasM. So this is, we're going to talk about state management. And this is a really exciting topic for me because there's a lot of activity happening in state management today. I think almost every other day you see somebody publish a new library on state management. So we're lucky to have two creators of or two contributors or two very important libraries. I'd love to hear about what's happening in your libraries. Can we start with the Redux? Tim, what's happening in the Redux community?
So since Redux is usually pretty heavily tied to React, although not exclusively, there's a lot of interesting stuff happening on the React side of things that is downstream effective towards what Redux does, particularly around a particular API known as context. If you're not familiar, it is basically a way of back-channel communicating between components across the ancestral divide. So I have a parent component, such as provider, if you're familiar with React Redux. And then I have a component that wants to consume some data information from that component, but way, 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 way down in the tree. So, I'm wrapped in some child of a child of a child. And typically that would be connect in that library. And what we are looking at is, so there's a whole bunch of stuff happening with async rendering in React, which is not yet enabled, but will be enabled soon. And the current API that exists does not really allow for async rendering, or it has a ton of side effects, basically. They're looking at revamping that API. So I've been graphing that into React Router, and I'm looking at graphing that into React Redux as well. And as a part of that, because of the whole kind of async behind the scenes motivation for it, there's a lot of interesting stuff that we would need to do to adjust how Redux works at its core to enable async rendering to happen, particularly around just intelligent updates of stuff. People put a lot of stuff into Redux, probably to a fault. Things that shouldn't belong in there, but it is what it is. And effectively propagating the parts of state that you want to get to a particular component, but just that state, so that it's not an all or nothing kind of update process, because async rendering will consume certain parts of that state at any point in time. And you kind of need a way to not necessarily synchronize, but ensure that it's only getting the parts of state that it wants, and it's only getting notified about those parts of state that it wants. This is something that Mobx just does out of the box. So it's interesting to see how we have to kind of map some of those concepts over to Redux's relatively small surface of APIs and behaviors.
Are you going to have to change like the API, like add new things to say like I'm interested in this part of the Redux store, or is it going to be mostly a transparent upgrade?
Hopefully it would be something transparent. I mean, this is all like theoretical kind of stuff. I know Andrew Clark, who kind of co-created Redux along with Dan Abramov, they have, I know Andrew in particular has some ideas about how to make this happen that reach into not just the React Redux layer, but also down into Redux land as well. It's mostly around how we implement middlewares, which is a way to extend Redux from just the basic I dispatch state into a store and then get it out later. So we need to figure out some of the boundaries there. I think it'll be a good chance too to, one thing that's always been kind of loose and not well defined in Redux. It has a behavior pattern, but it's not like documented in any ways, like like listeners and subscribing the listeners from within the listener, and then order of operations therein. That's something we have to kind of carefully maintain in React Redux. We have to make sure there's a basically parent components are notified before children, so there's not some cascading set of updates that happen, or at least the cascade is in the right direction. So yeah, we have to figure out some of these boundary conditions, and some of the edge case stuff. I think it'll be a good chance to kind of get that all together. I'm kind of packaging up a bunch of kind of outstanding things that have been on previously our next branch, but now that's on master, into a 4.0 release, which is really just, it's a maintenance release. It's not really anything earth-shattering. Probably the biggest thing is just the TypeScript bindings are much, much better. But my guess and estimation is after that, we'll probably take a hard look at like some of our API services and some of our behaviors, and either button things up or expand things and change them as is needed for the practicalities of what's coming down the road. And that would just be to enable things within React Redux to support some of the changes coming downstream in React itself. But it wouldn't be anything exclusive. It's not like we're changing Redux to be a React-only library. It's just we're opening up some more doors, which may be helpful with other libraries that bind to it. So in your Angular implementations or your Vue implementations, or just plain by itself Redux. So there's a lot of stuff that's up in the air that we'll hopefully get some answers on soon.
Cool. I'd love to hear the same for Giles. Are you going to say something?
Well, so I actually had a question. There was a tiny little tidbit in there that kind of really piqued my interest, where you're saying that people might put too much in Redux, and that's certainly something that I struggle with. Is like what do you, and this is not just with Redux, but with any type of state management solution. What do you put kind of at the core? And then what state do you push out to the periphery that's just there as maybe just computed properties right inside your component or what have you? And are there any good heuristics for finding how to strike that balance?
Yeah, I had a discussion with a coworker recently about this too. It's a very complex problem. It's not just simply what ends up inside of Redux and what doesn't. Because usually, again, a lot of people use it with React, but if you're using it with Angular and you have a controller that has its own local state as well, and then that whole tree of controllers. But if you're using it within the React context, you have local state within a component, and then you have the Redux state. But it's more complex than that because you have like other libraries that have state within them. Like the specific discussion I had with my coworker was around React Router and binding it to Redux. So I've kind of picking up the pieces left for React Router Redux, which is trying to bind them all together into one master library, which has a ton of pitfalls, particularly when it comes to the whole, shiny time travel, debugging, hot reloading. Like that really doesn't work. And that's because the state of Redux and the state of React Router are very different in their behavior. The same true for the state within a React component. It behaves differently as well. So the complexity comes in like figuring out, okay, what stuff should I try to tie together? What stuff should I pull apart? And I mean, there's obvious things that people are probably not going to put into Redux, like the state of a modal being open or not, or the state of a dropdown being open, or what the value of an input is. That stuff's pretty clear cut. It gets a little bit more hazy when you're dealing with concepts that are closer to your business level logic, or your application logic. I kind of hate the business logic term because he's writing code for a business. So application logic, call it that. So yeah, figuring out what stuff belongs in there or not, it usually comes down, for me at least, I try to think about stuff I need, like I was mentioning before, along that ancestral divide. So stuff I need that I might need in various different places. I was just building a research app here for the past few months where I had Redux at the ready, but I haven't not yet pulled the trigger on it because I have not yet needed it, because I've maintained a good tree structure of my components within my app where I'm pushing stuff down. Actually, I use the context library directly. That's just because I'm familiar with it. Otherwise, I might have started introducing Redux there. But for the most part, I haven't really needed stuff. I try to maintain kind of a three types of components. So like the dumb display component, the functional component that kind of does some stuff with those display components, and then what I call like a container or wrapper component that kind of glues all the big Lego pieces together into the spaceship or whatever you're building. And basically a lot of the kind of data input in my state comes from that top level, and I pass it into stuff down that's directly below it. So the flow of stuff is through props, and it's pretty well defined. It's not super deep for the most part. So yeah, I mean, it's a hard question to answer because it has so many different meanings in so many different contexts. No pun intended. But the long and short of it is basically anytime you need that information that you're storing in more than one place, it's probably something that should end up in Redux. But if it's something you need for just here right now, and it won't really leak out of that context, then you can probably keep it within that local state, and keep it contained within there, because you're going to get a lot more benefits out of the localized state container system in React or in Angular or in Vue, where things are already there for you. You don't have to establish things like your action creators and your reducers, and there's a lot of plumbing you have to establish to get those things in place. So yeah, and then also getting in external libraries into the mix as well is definitely problematic. Like one other case we came up with was when dealing with fetching data. So you make that fetch request, and then what do you do with the state of that fetch? Like, you're not going to put the network connection itself, whatever under the hood kind of stuff is happening there, like that state doesn't end up in Redux. You might have a trigger into there, but even then, like that feels like something that's local to that component. Like, I'm in loading mode. I've fired off my dispatch to get data, and at some point later, when that data is available, I will display it. But for now, I'm just in my local state of I have done this thing. It's no different to me than opening a dropdown. You know, that is a local action that has occurred. It might have, you know, downstream and system-wide effects, but the actual like pressing the button, that was local to where that button was pressed. And that's not what I care about. I care about the eventual effects of I've got this data coming in. So I can set up to receive that. And that can be stuff that's stored in the store and stuff I can pull out of that store and subscribe to. But I don't necessarily care about something being loading system-wide because it's very odd if you're trying to like fetch data remotely from multiple places within the application. It's probably better just to push that that request up the chain so it's apparent to all these things, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like, so the heuristic I'm hearing is don't reach for it until you need to share the data.
Yeah, I mean, it has side effects anytime you add one of these state libraries in. So some of those side effects can be more subtle. Like I used, prior to me being at SalesLoft, I was at a real estate company. And we built an admin interface, and I used Mobx for that. And, you know, I mean, it works great, but there are plenty of these kind of small little edge case specific things that you have to watch out for, which, you know, somebody who's just used to working with just plain React or plain Angular might be a little taken aback at those sorts of changes, especially if they differ in the behaviors that they're used to, like set states API versus a dispatch API. Those are very different, and they behave differently. So understanding that stuff can be difficult. So you just want to make sure that you're using it judiciously so that you don't have to you know, be defensively programming against all these side effects all over the place.
Cool. Michel, I'd love to get you in a mix here with about Mobx. You know, we could start with doing an update about Mobx, or if you have comments specifically about what Tim was speaking about, I think we can take it any way you want.
Yeah, I was listening with great interest to Tim, and I think I largely agree with the concept that you just started in the components. Although I have to admit, when you already are quite familiar with the problem domain, like you know what the business logic is, so to speak, then it can also be quite nice to start on the other end, ignore the UI entirely, capture your problem domain, and start unit testing that, writing logic around that. And only then start adding, building on the UI on top of that. That's an approach I also very like because it makes it easier to share logic with either other teams or front end or back end. But the interesting thing I think about Mobx is that it really doesn't matter much in Mobx state case, because if you look at a pure essence, it's basically about data flow. So what people often do is that they start using state inside their components. But if they have Mobx already in there, then they use just Mobx observables inside the component. So it's still local to the component. And as soon as you need something out or something to be reused or something in more standalone from your UI, the nice thing then is that you can just pull it out without you needing to shift paradigm. So you don't have to shift it anymore from set state to dispatch, for example. Because once a component is an observer, from Wix, it really doesn't matter anymore where the observable comes from. So it doesn't matter if it's in local state or just in a store at some entirely different place. And that's what I kind of like, because it makes it easy to move these pieces of state around to whatever place you feel convenient. And on the other hand, I also noticed that sometimes confuses people because they have the options to choose where it lives. Like where you had, if it's in a component, you set state. If it's outside the component, you use Redux. With Mobx, suddenly you have the option. You have observables, so you put them in a store or in a component.
Well, it sounds like from what I'm hearing, one thing that's a little bit different with Mobx is that you have a concept of a model, which you have an option to start with defining the model before you think about what that model is going to be attached to. Because in Redux land, it's a little bit more like your model essentially becomes the data that you return from your reducers, and it's about dispatching actions that perform transitions on this data, as opposed to defining your domain-specific thing and then using that thing in a component.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, I find it personally kind of easier to reason by starting from a model. But that's, I think, a personal thing. But it's very easy to form a mental model about your problem domain even before you know what the actions will be that you can take on the problem domain. And it makes it also easy to first come up, for example, with your TypeScript contracts, like this is data shape, these are the actions, or this might become the actions, and then coordinate this already across teams without really actually knowing anything about the implementation beyond that.
So as someone not super familiar with Mobx, how do you mentioned sharing, being able to extract some observable and move it from a component into a store? Like, what's the way that you pass around essentially these signals between components, and where do I extract them to? And are there multiple levels of sharing?
Yeah, definitely. So that's often the confusing or surprising part. It doesn't matter how you share them. So if you have a model and you pass in through the props, that's obviously work. But if you pass along across context, that also works. But if you even import it from a global singleton, just consume it from some other JavaScript module, that still works. Because the tracking is completely transparent, it doesn't actually really matter how the data ends up in the component. It's just because the component uses some data, it will start tracking that data. So that leaves a lot of architectural freedom, which is on one hand great, especially when working on large projects with multiple teams, because then you can design your ideal architecture ideally. On the other hand, it's as I said, it can also sometimes be overwhelming for new users because they have so many options how to structure their stuff.
Well, it works because you have what you call the observer is essentially a view that is observing the changes that are coming through the props, right? So you create something, you created some kind of a view that knows that there are things that might be coming through the props that are going to be observable, that might require the update to happen on the
it
layer,
actually
right?
doesn't relate to the props even. It detects what is used in the render, what is relevant for the render. That will be tracked. So even if you access an observable which just lives in the closure of the same component, that even will be tracked.
So is this some kind of a mechanism, like it's detecting the fact that you're reading that value? Is that what's causing that to become observed? Yeah,
exactly. So you could maybe compare it like suppose that every property in your model is an Rx stream. And then in your render function, you start to subscribe to all those properties which you use in the render. You set up a subscription. a listener, and then whenever one of those listeners fires, you call set state to cause the component to invalidate. That is roughly what is happening from a conceptual perspective.
Yeah, it's very similar to controller state within Angular or data within Vue. It's basically automatic connections and automatic updates of data that you reference. So it's happening behind the scenes a bit in terms of the actual connection. But it's basically once you reference that data, you're always ensured to have an updated version of it whenever you go to render. And then if that changes, it'll trigger a render for you.
Exactly.
I'm curious. Have you guys in React, Redux team? Have you guys talked about kind of the role of a model? Because it seems to be there are some things that you can model. You could say like you can use immutable, and you can say that you have an array of records, but you're essentially still dealing with state transitions and reducers. Do you guys have any thoughts, or do you have conversations about what role having something like a model might have in Redux?
Sure. I mean, the goal of Redux is to be pretty agnostic about that, though. So probably similarly to on the Mobx side of things, there's Mobx state tree, which is also really great. Mark Erickson's been putting together a really good ecosystem page on the Redux docs. So obviously, because we have a lot of tension, we have a lot of ecosystem players. And within there are a whole bunch of different modeling systems, middlewares that will enable certain types of behaviors. One that's really popular is Redux Saga. So it kind of organizes your actions into these series of sagas, which is a way of stringing together a bunch of complex events. So, I want to fetch some data, then do some computation on that data, then fetch more data. And I can define that very succinctly. It's just one action. And there are a bunch of things to connect to. So we do actually represent ourselves as an observable. The store itself is an observable. So there's things to connect over to the RxJS universe. And yeah, there's basically a whole smorgasbord of different things you could pull in there. But we ourselves are staying agnostic to it. And whatever kind of requirements you have, if you want something that's more simple, like Redux Thunk, which basically just turns action creators into functions, or if you need something more complex like Redux Saga, you can kind of make that choice dependent on whatever your application needs are.
Michel, can you talk a little bit about the Mobx state tree? It's a really interesting project. I'm curious what your were you contributing to it, or did you what was the role in what was your role in creating the creation of that project, if any?
Yeah, so I started Mobix state tree actually already a while ago, and it was basically a proof of concept on how Mobix could be used if you wanted it. Like people were aware, how do I organize my stores? How do I serialize it? Those kind of things. But that actually got quite popular, quite some pull requests, and some active maintainers. And so for that reason, we built it out further, and it's now a properly usable product, actually. But what the basic concept is that it has a very explicit notion of how models are defined. And it is a bit similar to, for example, prop types in React in that regard, like you describe the shape of the data. And on top of that, it makes some really opinionated choices, which Mobix itself doesn't make. So, for example, it doesn't work with classes, and it doesn't work with free graph structures. It really specifies that your state tree should be a tree, which is on one hand limiting, but on the other hand, it makes certain problems very easily solvable, like serialization, like time traveling, those kind of things. Because to do these kinds of concepts, you need to be able to make some assumptions about the state, like that you can to traverse it in an efficient manner, for example. And so that's basically what Mobx state tree does. It makes those very opinionated choices on top of Mobx. So it limits in a certain way, but you get back for that a lot of built-in functionality.
What's the like? Where do you see? Oh, also, I think you also have something that you've been working on, Immer. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. So Immer is basically a weird side effect, side project, side effect, also. So it actually starts with Mobx. Mobx currently targets all ES5 environments. And to do that, it has some inconveniences, like arrays not being really true arrays, and objects needing to have their properties declared up front. These are the two most notable limitations of Mobx in that regard. Just to make sure that all ES5 environments are supported. So in the next major, I want to change that limitation by using proxies. And proxies allows us to lift all these limitations, to have real arrays, to have dynamically extendable objects. So to become more familiar with proxies, I want to build some real but small project with it. And so based on the concept of copy on write collections, I just started a small experiment to see whether I can create collections that whenever you try to change something through a proxy, it can just copy on write that part of the tree and structurally share the rest of it. And that turned out to be actually really feasible. And only after that, I realized that that actually makes writing Redux reducers way more simple. And so I published it, and that got actually amazing lot of attention. So I think people are often struggling with this problem, like how to write your reducers in a concise way, because it's gathered in the first 2 weeks. I made it in the holidays, already over 2,000 stars or something. So that's pretty amazing. And that's basically because it has a few quite unique advantages. One, it's really small and works just with plain JavaScript objects. So you don't have a new API to learn, like if you would be using Immutable.js or something. The second really big advantage, in my opinion, is that it's completely strongly typed. And I think that is a pretty unique feature, because most libraries have only or not at all strictly typable data structures. So with Immutable.js, you can come a certain way with typings, but in the end, when you need to do a deep mutation, you will lose all the type information. And Immer solves that problem because it just is operating on plain data structures. You can mutate them temporarily in a very confined way. And actually, when an Immer producer ends, it turns out that because everything was proxied, the original data is completely preserved, and a new data structure will be generated from you based on the mutations you made. So it's really taking advantage of both worlds.
This is kind of a little bit of a side note, but I've been eyeing proxies and wanting to use them for so long. But it's still, I think it's, what is it, IE11 that doesn't support them? Like when can the community take that leap? It sounds like, if Immer is based on proxies, then a lot of people already are. And like, when is that a wise choice?
IE usage is really low. It's at 2% and dropping.
Okay.
So,
So the answer
most of that is Most of that is foreign. So if your audience is US based, then it's even lower. And I found that it's actually getting, it's really close to that tipping point where like managers get it, that you can explain to them like, hey, we should drop IE support entirely. And at that point, then things really pick up because all the greenfield browsers are very, very far ahead from where IE left off at 11.
Don't forget about React Native Android.
Yeah, that is true. And that depends a lot on the makeup of Android in particular, just because it lags so far behind iOS, which also has another set of limitations in terms of what it supports, but does support proxies. I think just checked on Can I Use? It's like at 77%. If you account for all the even the very esoteric but surprisingly popular Android browsers from old versions. Proxies were in the 2015 spec, so we've had almost 3 years to pick up on this stuff. Hopefully it'll happen soon.
Yeah, that's true.
So it's funny when I tweeted about this yesterday. I mean, you said like I've been dying to use like proxies for a long time. In the JavaScript world, 3 years is a very, very, very long time.
Long time.
But
yeah, and it's hard because it's like it's a piece of functionality that can't be back. You know, you can't polyfill it.
Yeah.
Like so many other features, it's a core feature of the runtime.
Yeah. So for Immer, the story is a little more simple. Immer also works on non-proxy environments. It will just be a bit slower.
Is it that like the arrays, you can't make arrays lazy and what have you, or?
No, that works well. So, but it has to do change detection in some cases. So it has to diff in some cases, which makes it slower. And in most cases, it can be avoided, but sometimes you have to check. So basically, it's 2 or 3 times slower to use Immer without proxies, which is in practice often neglectable. But for Mobx, it will be a big issue. So there. We will probably support 2 majors for a long time, one with proxies and one without proxies.
Okay.
Yeah, I was gonna say it sounds a lot like the React Router situation, the React Redux situation, where we have to figure out what we're doing backwards compatibility wise with the new context API, with async rendering. There's a lot of stuff we have to break on that hopefully we can figure ways around.
I was wondering with the changes that happen to the context and the stuff that you guys are rethinking around Redux, is there is reconciliation of changes, like where you might have a situation where you have async loading of components and then some component, a child loaded and then it needed something? Like, is it possible to have side effects from loading a React component that might cause a, having to do a round trip to the store to push additional changes?
Yeah, that's one part of what we kind of need to figure out with the core and sort of some of this buttoning up of edge case behaviors, where that kind of like declarative substate of sorts, or a derived state. There is an API coming in React, I guess 17, whenever async drops. If you look on the React.js/RFCs repo on GitHub, you can see it. The context API is defined there, but also there's another one coming along where they're going to deprecate a bunch of fairly popular APIs, lifecycle methods in particular, in the React world. So component, I think it's, component will mount, component will update, component will receive props. A lot of all the wills go away. And when they're adding is get derived state from props, which is a way of, at that point in time, based on the props I've got given into me, what kind of state will exist within the system, or what effect does that have on the state? Go ahead.
So that is a did derived state?
Yeah, it's a derived state within the React component. So this is purely just React stuff. but we probably need to match that in some way. And we need to figure out some of the edge cases around, when you are essentially listening to a dispatch, but you want to issue another dispatch on top of that. How do you enqueue that? How do you make sure that resolves properly, and you don't end up with flashes of content that's partially rendered or in some sort of odd state temporarily? This is coming up in React Router too, so it's going to be a fun challenge to solve. Mainly because we've always thought about this stuff in a very synchronous way. So once you start breaking apart that at the seams, two components can render completely independently at different frames, basically, with potentially very large delays between them. What starts happening then? It gets very complex and interesting. So we just need to make sure we have the API services in place to enable that kind of behavior without driving everyone mad.
Yeah, I'm interesting to see on what impact that in the end will have on mixed users as well. As far as I could reason so far, I think it has less impact because basically with Mobx, components are already independently rendering from their parents or their children. So basically the sideways loading thing. And it already does support the fact that notifying that a component is still versus the moment it actually re-renders out of different moments in time. But still, it's such a huge change in the core of React that it's really hard to anticipate all the scenarios. So it's pretty interesting subject to follow.
Yeah. The Mobx scenario, it is going to be a lot easier because you have the nice kind of tree effect of observables kind of automatically set up. So you have some sort of observable value, and then you have a computed value on top of that observable, and then perhaps you have something that is watching that and will issue some other changes downstream. But it's pretty easy to see where that flow happens. Whereas within Redux, it might be a little bit harder to see where that is. So hopefully we can clear that up so it's not so hard to see that connectivity. Because, really, Redux at its core is very much a black box in terms of, you dispatch an action in, and then you might be able to look through your reducers and figure it out. But for the most part, you can't poke at it and say, like, if I issue this action, it would have these kinds of effects downstream. You as a human might be able to look at it and say, okay, the action type is of this name, so it's probably going to affect that kind of area of the state. But there's no computational way to do that.
Is there any plan, or has anyone ever tried? Because being able to do that seems like kind of a prerequisite for being able to kind of do the incremental, incremental updates or kind of understanding basically cause and effect. So that I'm going to affect this area of the system and the thing subscribing to this. Or is it just this is just outside the domain and we'll never touch it, and maybe. Well,
it's something, again, going back to those ecosystem players. It's something that they're solving in particular ways. Again, Redux is kind of agnostic to that sort of stuff by design, just because we want to be small and by itself easily understandable. And for the most part, 99% of the time, it's pretty obvious. You have some sort of dispatch action load posts that's going to show up on the post key in your state. It's not like rocket science. So you don't have to know what a monad is, basically. But if you do, great. And and this all gets back to the design question earlier too, of what ends up in there or not. It's not just what state ends up in there, but it's also what complexity ends up in there, and what kind of difficult stuff to handle ends up in there. But I found especially with my Redux usage and my Mobx usage, there's a lot of stuff that just ends up being almost boilerplate, and I'm just copy pasting between like, okay, I've got like a list of users and a list of posts and a list of emails and a list of blah blah blah. It's a lot of like CRUD stuff basically. That none of it really breaks the mold too far if you have like a good base abstraction. So, and similarly to the Redux, as long as it has a good kind of base abstraction for just state containment, it can be taken in a lot of different places fairly easily. So, well, this is all like fairly worrying, I guess, to a lot of people. It's really not that bad. I don't think we're going to end up with something that's anything more complex than it is right now. Just perhaps a little bit more powerful and a little bit easier to work with. There might be some things that are unclear, but that's on us as maintainers to clear up for everyone, and to either help establish patterns or identify patterns that get established by the community, and document those and make sure they're well known, or enable APIs or make changes to the APIs to have these things be successful. I mean, it's why React is deprecating those lifecycle methods, because they're actually they're not going away. They're actually changing in names, so they just become unsafe all caps underscore and then whatever it was before. So unsafe component will mount, unsafe component will update. So they still exist. It's just they are similar to the little React in-joke of secret internals do not use, you will be fired key that's on the React top level object. These are like, you can use this, but understand there's going to be a lot of problems. So hopefully we can avoid those kinds of APIs in Redux and whatnot. We don't need to have an unsafe get state or something. And yeah, we can basically make this easy for everyone involved, while still enabling cool stuff.
What I also noticed in these kind of discussions is that it can sound all complex and hairy when you think about how it's implemented. And if you're like trying to trace for yourself what's happening and you're putting console.logs in all the hooks and then make some complex setup of components, and then you predict something and it works differently because there's a lot of optimization underneath, then it can be kind of confusing. But if you like not trying to understand what's happening, but if you're just trying to use the abstraction that's provided, I notice then the questions often disappear. I mean, people come often with edge cases in these kind of situations which are not real life. And I think that's something we often forget. That people, from a natural curiosity, which is in principle really good, really try to understand how an abstraction like async rendering works. But then they really get in the hairy details and they have to also understand everything before they actually crock it.
One of the things that, and this applies to Immer, and I'm curious actually how this works in Mobx. One of the things that I hear about people really like about, or people that like Redux, one thing that they'll mention is that they like the ability to be able to dispatch an action and then have kind of multiple reducers respond to that action. And I can see that being tricky in situations where, like, when you start thinking about reconciliation, where you might expect that I think it'd be like convenient to have an action just be handled and it's been resolved. But what are your thoughts, Tim, about about this pattern in general, about having multiple reducers respond to one action?
I mean, that gets in the complexities I was talking about before of, how do you deal with stuff that talks across multiple parts of the state tree? Something we still not yet have figured out, and is kind of the hanging chat of big API services that's never yet been implemented is, so we include a utility function called combine reducers with Redux. It's pretty popular. An unfortunate side effect of including that utility function is that people kind of assign excess value to it. So similar to like putting stuff in the store that probably doesn't belong in the store, they put a lot of stuff into this combined reducer structure that maybe doesn't belong in it. Mm-hmm. And one of the limitations of it is that you're basically putting your store into a set of slices of state. So you basically pass in an object with a bunch of keys, and the value of those keys is a function, a reducer, that will return the state for that key. So you might have your post reducer that's on the post key, and your users reducer that's on the users key. And within those reducers, they only get the slice of state that they are responsible for, and they can't like cross originate. So you can't get like the author from the user's state into the post table directly. And maybe that's fine. Maybe that's how you want to do it. But the limitations of like, yeah, I need to essentially join together a bunch of data into one kind of final derived state. A lot of people kind of miss the fact that you can actually combine reducers. You can, there's a library that Andrew Clark put together, reduce reducers, which basically just combines all your reducers together as one function and feeds them into each other. But you know, then you get into some weird order of operations stuff, and this is where the kind of async stuff introduces itself again once that comes to bear. Where you know what happens to the order of these reductions or reducers being run. And
yeah, I mean, to me, it feels kind of like an abuse. Like it's not Redux, it's not an event listener, right? Like having multiple reducers that handle the same action feels much more like the event listener paradigm, where you're broadcasting some event and then you're doing it. Whereas, you know, you really, you know, I've found in like my Redux applications, you know, having ownership of data is very important. And if the shape of the data is defined in one place, it's effectively defined by the reducer. And so, I mean, that's definitely not something I would do either.
Yeah, I've had to break that down in a couple places. When I was using Redux within our at the last company, I was using Redux in our front application. The backend admin interface was all Mobx, so on both sides of the fence here. But we had some interesting complexities around. So we're doing real estate listings and kind of sharing the state between, you know, we had the concept of a search party. So when you're doing your real estate search, you have a group of friends together. So knowing that, you know, friend A and friend B like this particular listing and showing that, and then showing their information, and then knowing that. When you like hit that like button, what if downstream effects that has to have on the rest of state? It's not just liking that listing; it's also updating on your individual user your like count, things like that. Kind of derivatives. It would be a lot easier inside of Mobx because that's just a computed, and it automatically observes that relation. I forget the exact specifics of how we had to glue it all together. It's been a bit, but yeah, like dealing with that stuff is definitely not easy, and that's something that hopefully we can make easy. No lie.
I think if you have a action that is used in multiple reducers, that's usually, I think, a really small step away from actually having redundant data in your state, which is, I noticed, often a cause for bugs and a sign that you should somewhere be using reselect or something to derive information from your state instead of having some piece of data living twice.
Yeah, that's something that I see with it's because I do mentoring, so I look a lot of people's code who are learning, you know, and then a lot of times when you're not experienced enough to realize the power of like declarative programming, you end up doing a lot of things imperatively, in which case you end up doing something, and then you update a bunch of things, and you have these like state transitions, or you have an action that changes like 5 properties or 6 properties and does a bunch of resetting, maybe recomputing stuff. Like there's all kinds of stuff, and then a lot of the complexity is just simplified by giving this thing a name and then making most of those values in one way or another computed. Either it be derived with reselect or derived with a computed property.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that's kind of the main thing behind this new get drive state from props API, is that they're trying to keep it in this declarative form. I mean, it's very common to turn set state into a imperative action, an imperative series of actions as well. And they want to instead think about it on the other side of things. Once the props come in, what kind of state effects will that have? And it kind of forces you into this declarative structure. But I mean, it's for your benefit. It helps to think in code in that way. So this is all they're all keeping it within the declarative structure within React, which is great, because that makes a lot of the complexities of async rendering go away if you don't have to worry about this huge branching imperative structure of code that handles every single edge case in a linear way. If instead you just think about, okay, well, just what is the state of the world right now, and then what would that look like next? Kind of one step at a time.
Well, this is actually brings us to an interesting question. I think we're getting close to the end of the. Oh, actually, we're actually just over. Are you guys okay for one more question, and then we'll close off for today?
Sure.
So I don't know if you've noticed, but it seems like state machines are getting really hot recently. There's a bunch of people doing talks. There's a bunch of experimentations, and there's like XState. I think there's a bunch of libraries, React Automata. There's a bunch of things that are coming up around state machines. Have you guys had any thoughts or any conversations around how state machines can affect UI development?
I don't think directly within Redux, but again, our ecosystem is really strong, so a lot of these things are being grafted into Redux, which is really neat. And some of the stuff that's kind of been there already that can be turned into a state, like Redux Sagas are a great example of that. You can kind of turn those into state machines, but there are some libraries developing that make use of Redux as a container for that information and that state, but let you graft on that state machine concept pretty easily and sort of declaratively define what that state machine is, rather than a bunch of kind of imperative things or interdependent reducers, that kind of complexity. It's interesting because, yeah, this fits very well with what we're trying to do on the UI side of things. Let's now apply that over onto the back-end application logic side of things. And it's good to see those two meeting in the middle, because I think it'll help this transition towards async rendering as being a very big thing in the UI space. It'll make that process a lot easier, so that the world doesn't explode around you as you add it in.
I hope a nice side effect of that whole transition will be that generators are more appreciated and understood by the community. They're such a powerful abstraction. I think Redux Saga is the best example of that. But just thinking in terms of kind of processes that talk to each other has so much potential benefits, and I hope that really becomes more accessible. Like, generators sound really scary. The syntax even looks a little bit scary. But they can be really elegant.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for modeling the side effects. I mean, I think what's interesting is that it seems like development communities are constantly trying to escape the gravitational pull of like MVC, but then we always get drawn back and captured. So you have like React coming up as like, oops, there's the V again, and now we've been talking about the M. we've been talking about the M, for the last hour, and then it sounds like the next segue that I'm hearing is kind of talking about the C. Like, how do you actually manage these transitions of one state to the other and stitch together, like with Redux Saga, these kind of complex interactions that connect states with external things and kind of thread those needles all the way through.
Yeah,
well,
definitely.
Let's see. Well, I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope you guys can we can continue this conversation in a couple of months if you guys are open for it. To hear more updates in your ecosystems and talk more about state management. As it's, I did a tweet recently, and it was a poll about the significance of state management in applications, and it came out to something like 50%. The biggest percentage of people said that state management is 50% of the application. So it's a really big part of building applications. So I hope we can continue talking about this if you're open to it.
Sure.
Cool. Well, thanks, guys, and have a great day. And thank you so much for joining us on this podcast. And I'm just going to close it off. Do you guys want to say anything before we close off?
So if you enjoy writing cool software with cool people, please come work at SalesLoft, salesloft.com/careers. We're hiring. We like developers. And if you want to work at a really cool company that just doubled its revenue last year and is continuing to do so every single year, please come work with us. We're awesome.
Do you guys have remote, or is it all, like, where are you guys located?
We're in Atlanta, Georgia. We have an office out in San Francisco as well. We occasionally do remote. Depends on the person, depends on the scenario, and depends on what they'll do. And we have a really, really intensive interview process. It's kind of fun. I think our head of HR went through 18 interviews before we brought her in. Yeah. We really like to make sure we have a good fit with the people we bring on. But don't let that intimidate you. It's kind of a fun process. And at the very least, we want to make sure that if you don't join up, you still got something good out of the experience. But yeah, we have developer positions, UX researchers, designers, if you're into sales. Fun fact, last night was our end of fiscal year 2018. We made more revenue in 3 hours than we made in all of 2013. Our sales team is pretty nuts. So if you want to work on the sales side of things, please get in contact. We have some great positions available.
Awesome. Guys?
Yeah, and I can add, I think the same. We're always hiring as well. We don't do remote working, but we are located in one of the greatest cities of Europe, Rotterdam. So that company is called Mendix. And what we do is actually really cool. It's basically the dream job of any programmer because everything we do is on a meta level. So what we built is basically an application studio to build applications. So if you're tired of building websites or small applications for or consultancy-like jobs, I want to get really at the core level of programming, let us know.
It's Lisp macros for applications.
Are you guys using Mobx inside of your application builder? Is the generated code have Mobx in it, or something that
depends on what target you generate for. But some of them have already, yes. And the studio itself is entirely Mobx based.
Cool.
But it's used for really by really big companies, so that's really cool. It's like the SAPs of the world, etc. They use this stuff to build software for their clients. So it's like software engineering, but on a different level, like software engineering for software engineering.
That's awesome. Charles, you have anything you want to?
I mean, I guess, I'll bow to peer pressure and say we are also hiring. If you want to come work at Frontside, we're a very outward-focused digital product studio. We've been doing UI for a really long time, and so we're very even dating back into like the Java Swing days. So we think very deeply about these problems, and love to participate in conversations like this.
And I will say something different, which is that this.labs, we do mentoring and staff augmentation. So if anyone's looking to learn about building applications effectively and effective state management, we'll be happy to teach that and support support your team in building things with Vue, React, Ember, Angular. We have mentors for all of that, so we can do a lot of these fun things. And so with that, I'm going to say thanks for listening to Modern Web Podcast. You can find us online at modern-web.org or on Twitter at modern.web. That's modern, D-O-T, web. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great day.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.